I learned that the playwright August Wilson would start his plays on napkins because it prevented the fear of failure that we all receive when confronting the blank page. A dancer whose work I appreciate a great deal, Paul Taylor, I learned when he first debuted his now landmark avant-garde style in New York City, received a review that was so harsh, the reviewer left the newsprint completely blank, as you're seeing on the screen. Lewis Horst just put his initials and said about Paul Taylor, well, if he won't dance, it was that minimalist, I won't write, and published it just that way. And I smile thinking of it when I see the ads for Paul Taylor's dance company each year at Lincoln Center. I learned of a legendary RKO screen test for a dancer that said, can't sing, can't act, balding, can dance a little, and learned that it was in reference to Fred Astaire. Martin Luther King Jr.'s history surprised me in this regard, the creative orator that he was. One day, when thinking about this topic of creativity and failure, I just happened to walk by Sotheby's in New York City, and they were auctioning off a set of papers of Martin Luther King Jr. So I went in, and I was stunned to see in seminary in a transcript of A's and B's, but he did receive two C's in public speaking. You have to wonder what that teacher thought when King went on to lead the nation with the power of his spoken truth, and also what happened to King himself. We know these stories. We hear various versions of them at commencement time often, as we did at Harvard recently when J.K. Rowling spoke about what she called the fringe benefits of failure. At the time, if you measure success through monetary means, the richest woman in England having created the Harry Potter franchise, but she unveiled the improbable journey of arriving there, majoring in classics, receiving every rejection letter possible from every publishing house imaginable for this seemingly wacky idea. She describes rock bottom, though, that period of time, as she put it, as the quote, solid foundation on which she built her rise. I'm not sure what it is about Harvard and failure, but Oprah Winfrey came, delivered a commencement speech, and two, disclosed the importance of failure for her innovative life, citing failure as important for offering information and feedback that could come no other way. Perhaps the most dramatic example, to my mind's eye, are the legendary exploits of extraordinary explorers, such as that of Alex Honnold, whose image you're seeing here as he scaled Yosemite's 3,200-foot El Capitan surface without a rope. That's him, just with his hands, scaling that rock. And as he describes the tenacity that he's harnessed for these seemingly superhuman endeavors, he focuses on the gift of failure in his ultimately successful pursuit. As I began to aggregate these stories just out of interest, I realized that the very conditions most people would like to avoid, most organizations would like to avoid, these individuals had turned into irreplaceable advantage. It made me realize that we need to reconsider the true story of creativity and triumph and success. It made me understand quite clearly that the path to creative endeavor is never straight. I was oriented early to thinking about the importance of failure. I, in fact, wrote my own college application essay to Harvard, where I now teach. I didn't expect to come back and be a professor here, about failure. I wrote about this experience I had. Actually, I've never talked about the details of it in public before. I will with this group. I feel that I want to be even more vulnerable with you, given that I can't be there in person. Thank you. Now I can see more of the room. That's great. I wrote about, in fact, the surprise of being a very young person winning this art award that gave me the foundation for my life. As a ninth grader, I won what the NAACP had at the time as an Olympiads of creative pursuits. It was called ACT-SO. It was an acronym. And the annual competition was a national one. Every state would put forward in various different categories their top contender. And I won that year in the painting category. And the award was, in fact, a computer and some money, which, as a 14-year-old is a big deal. And then 2 years later, I applied again and I didn't place at all, which was a little devastating because it takes place in a football stadium and there's a lot of visibility. And so I wrote about the kind of resilience and grit that it gave me as a young person. Didn't tell my parents that I was writing about failure to apply to Harvard, and only revealed that I wanted to do this a day before the deadline. So I forced their hand. As I was writing more about this, I went back to Harvard as an alum about 15 years ago, and ran into the dean of Harvard College admissions. We were at an event and he saw my name tag and he looked at and she said, "I remember your application essay." It turns out that he himself had an experience of failure, and he had become truant and like fell in with the wrong crowd and had to leave his high school, and applied to a high school in the neighboring town. And as a result, looks for resilience and grit in applicants to Harvard. I had no idea. But the fact that we often discount the importance of failure in our lives made me want to understand its role. And I began to write a book that became The Rise, about which your executive director has spoken so kindly, which was published in 2014. I wrote about, in narrative form, three central ideas in The Rise that I'd like to share with you today. As I researched and studied these lives of artists in particular, along with innovators of all kinds, I realized that there were three main traits that they all shared that led to extraordinary innovations built on the improbable. The first is that they cared about something greater than success, and that is a kind of mastery. The second is that they gave up on the seemingly conventional wisdom to show your work in public often, and instead focused on the irreplaceable embryonic time of the private domain for their creative pursuits. And the final trait they all showed, it's a difficult paradox to master, is the ability to be gritty, but to know when to quit. So I want to take these ideas in turn, and I'm so eager to get your questions after I do. As I speak, I hope that you'll ask yourselves as you go forward how you might want to consider or reconsider your creative practice, your collective culture at an institution, and how these ideas might apply to your personal lives. So, mastery, what do I mean by this? It's not a word that we use very often, or at least I certainly didn't. I came to think about mastery when I first came across a story in the New York Times about a set of near Olympic caliber archers, of all things. And it was a story that was thinking through the importance and difficulty of constantly hitting the gold, constantly hitting that target. I wanted to see their practice in person. So I went up on one May day, cold day, and dragged a family member with me, not knowing what I would see, and was eagerly anticipating this archery team. The coach drove them up in this gray van, and the women filed out with kind of bandanas on and arrows and bows and toolkits and pliers and things. And they looked like a set of sort of carefree warriors walking out on Columbia University's Baker's Field where they practice. I mentioned that these archers are all women because at Columbia University, the topic of this article, men try out for the archery team, but apparently the women are the best. So it's an all women team, at least still, and at the time then. I watched as the archers prepared to shoot, and I noticed one who I stood behind as she began to let her arrows fly. The first arrow hit that seven, and then a nine, and then an 8, and then she ultimately hit that bullseye, but the next arrow didn't hit the target at all. And I watched as she began to kind of shuffle and asked her coach not to look downrange with his binoculars to see the target, to see where it actually had gone. And that she continued in this pursuit again and again. In this endeavor, you have to account for everything that could ultimately knock your arrow off course. Wind speeds, your own fatigue at pulling back the 50-pound draw weight, and so forth. And I began to see how they maintained their focus and tenacity to find what T.S. Eliot would call the still point of the turning world. I realized as I was gripped by this pursuit of an endeavor without glory or fame, no one was going to televise this, no one was going to become famous for this, that I was seeing the distinction between success and mastery. Success is knowing that you can hit that 10 ring once, but mastery is knowing that it means nothing if you can't do it again and again. What it means, that distinction, is caring about not just the arrival, but the reach. These archers had to care about being better than their seconds younger selves, really the heart of the creative endeavor. Success is just one moment in time, but mastery is a commitment to a constant pursuit. We thrive when we haven't just done it all, but when we know that there's more to do. We see this wisdom often in the arts. I think of Navajo pottery weaving and the spirit line that's often embedded, suggesting an onward march or an intended imperfection to catalyze future creativity. But I want to just parenthetically speak about why this reach, this pursuit is wired into us, why it's so important that we attend to it, why it's so important that we care about what I would call the near win, and how central it is to creativity. If you've ever watched, if you've ever watched the Olympics, you've seen the propulsive force of the near win. If you've ever seen an Olympic medal stand and noticed that the bronze medalists look pretty happy with themselves relative to the silver medalists who often look a little dejected, which is illogical because they're in a better position than bronze, you're looking at the power of the near win. The Nobel Prize winning team, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, discovered that the mind tends to dwell on what they call, counterfactual thinking. The idea there is that the mind becomes more granular and specific when faced with coming just shy of a goal, just shy of a goal. So imagine, in my case, that uh, after all of the extraordinary work to come to Richmond and to make these provisions to speak remotely, the tech just didn't work. Well, I'd probably never, go another day without having my house hardwired as it is right now with Ethernet and everything else to ensure that I wouldn't miss anything again. But if there was no real way to determine why I couldn't present to you, well, there's no way to fix it. And I might go on to have other kinds of tech issues. Or imagine I had missed my plane, or you've missed a plane to come to Nsika by an hour. You might go on to miss more flights, but if you missed your plane by 5 minutes, you'd probably never miss a plane again. It's easier to imagine what you could have done differently. We are propelled by this near win. How many times have we looked at a work of art and not known that the artist considers that work to be simply a near win, something that created propulsion for other work? If you've ever seen, as many of you in this room have, a work by Paul Cézanne in person or in reproduction, you have likely been looking at a near win. Paul Cézanne didn't sign 90% of his paintings. His goal was to realize nature in paint. That's his term, his phrase for his objective. He only signed 10%, those that came closest to that objective. If you've ever read works by William Faulkner, you likely are reading a near win. The most famous is The Sound and the Fury, a work that he found to be so far away from his own conception of how the novel should end that he published in one of the novel's later editions as an appendix an ending that better satisfied him. Or if you've ever read a work by Franz Kafka, you are absolutely reading a near win. He saw only incompletion where others would seek to praise his work. He purportedly had one last request upon his death. He wanted all of his diaries and letters and manuscripts to be burned. He asked his friend of over 2 decades, Max Brod, to live out this request. Some friend, Max Brod, published all the works we have by Kafka. In fact, during Kafka's lifetime, he'd only published 450 pages of text. The New York Times recently reported that a new book on Kafka's work is published nearly every 10 days for the past 14 years. Poor Kafka, rolling over his grave. Michelangelo put it best in a prayer. He said, "Lord, grant that I desire more than I can accomplish." And this is the mantra of mastery. Masters care about the reach, not the arrival. Masters don't become experts because they take a subject to its end, but because they realize that there isn't one. We all thrive when we stay on our own leading edge. Mastery, this creative pursuit, means being in a constant state of beta. Now, how do we sustain the difficulties that can come with this constant pursuit, feeling as if you've never quite arrived? Uh, Oftentimes, I think of this, the best example of this sort of frustrating yet inescapable pursuit in thinking through the life of Albert Einstein. How many of your offices look this way? I'll admit my office looks this way a lot when I'm at my most creative. Albert Einstein's office is what I'm showing you here on the last day of his life at Princeton University at the Institute for Advanced Study. He was at the time working on his theory of everything. And I'm showing you this photograph that if we were to read in one of my classes in art history, we could think through in terms of the index of the back turned chair, the impression that his own bodies offered it, suggesting that he still had the energy to come back and was continuing to work in the dense splay of papers. Around that time, he received a letter from a young girl, just 6 years old, who was having difficulties in math. She wanted some reassurance from him. He couldn't offer any. Instead, he said, "Do not worry about your difficulties in math. I can assure you that mine are still greater." So, how do we get around the sense of defeat that can emerge? This is quite important. And one way to get around it is by cultivating the wisdom of the amateur, which is critical for creativity. And I would argue the deliberate amateur. Um, to understand this idea, I ended up interviewing a set of Nobel Prize winning scientists, Andrei Geim and Konstantin Novoslov, who discovered the first material isolated on the planet that's only one atom layer thick and is revolutionizing innovation in the electronics industry and in the arts. Andre Geim, though, is the first person ever to win an Ig Nobel an award for work that first makes you laugh and then makes you think. And every year they're given out again at Harvard. I'm not sure what it is about Harvard and failure, but he won for levitating a live frog with magnets. Now, when they published this in the preeminent journal Nature, the standard bearing text for science, it was in April. So people thought this was, in fact, an April Fool's Day joke. But in fact, they had found a way to harness diamagnetism and produced this result. Andrei Geim and Konstantin Novoslov have as this practice in their laboratory a period of time that they devote to the curiosity of the child, of to dropping their expertise and allowing for permission that they give themselves, license that they give themselves to explore in domains of expertise that are not their own. They call this period Friday night experiment time. And that's a time where they do things like see whether they can harness diamagnetism, as they did for this first experiment. The next was to see something else sort of wacky. They wanted to see if they could replicate the feature of a gecko's sort of hairy feet and create a tape that would let humans walk up walls, which they did. And the final Friday night experiment was the Nobel Prize winning isolation of graphene. Just to show what graphene does, I spent some time learning all about this and interviewing these two individuals. It is thinner than silk, it's stronger than steel, it's the most conductive property we have, and they found it using things so rudimentary that they were laughed out of the field at first with the Ig Nobel Award. Scotch tape and a pencil. They isolated graphene by successively ripping off layers of graphite hanging out in an ordinary pencil. And after a series of attempts using slightly more fancy tactics than what I just described in terms of the tape itself, but not much, they found that they had, in fact, the thinnest recorded attempt to isolate graphene. When they won the Nobel Prize, they discussed the importance of creativity and play for the hard sciences. Yeah. Oftentimes, Andre Geim says, I say I don't research, I only search. And for that, play is crucial. Creativity is crucial. These Friday night experiments are a way, a framework to think through how we all need to find time and space to drop our expertise in order to, in fact, maintain proficiency in this pursuit of mastery. As these scientists realized, maintaining proficiency is best kept by finding ways to periodically give it up. It's an old idea, of course, for artists, the idea of beginner's mind. It's critical for innovation of all kinds. Why? Because we're often faced with high stakes when we seem to have created something so innovative that it looks wrong. Creative solutions and innovative ideas are often so counterintuitive that they can seem like failure. Friday night experiments surround us. We often don't honor the role that they play in our lives. I'll offer you a few examples based upon on the research. Um, Google, for example, they created waves when they seemed to be pulling back on the equivalent of their Friday night experiment time. They offer what they call 20% time to their engineers, time where they allow employees to really detour, as the scientists did. Samuel Morse spent 20 years in what he described as the failed pursuit of being a painter. He was the first professor of painting at New York University and could not support his family that wasn't living with him in his studio in New York when he was teaching. He would make work such as these. The Grand Gallery of the Louvre is a work you're seeing from 1932 on this screen. And he would write to his family that he wanted to be a painter of great renown on the level of a Titian, Michelangelo, Rembrandt. That was his goal. But his students began to notice as he would teach and he would permit them to come into his studio that eventually it was occupied more with wires and pliers and not paints and canvases over time. He began to innovate through other means. He began to create what we now know of as the telegraph. Now, I'm showing you this seemingly odd image because it's the only one that exists that gives you a sense of the gift of so called failure that became the foundation for the beginning of the communications revolution. You're looking at the first model of the telegraph. The wooden outline that creates the object is, in fact, wood that mimics the look of a stretcher. And you can also see the paint marks. He transformed the raw material from that failed pursuit into the foundations to create the telegraph. It transformed how the world could communicate. News that would take days could come nearly instantaneously at the time. I wanted to understand the riddle of Samuel Morse when I wrote the book. I wanted to understand how one could pivot after a pursuit of a certain kind and transform into grit that was portable into another domain. So I went to speak to a scholar whose name is Angela Duckworth. Angela Duckworth is known, I mean, MacArthur winning scholarship on the importance of grit. She has studied grit in a variety of environments, from educational context to that of the US military. And the research shows that grit apparently is the best predictor of achievement in these contexts, far more so than talent or IQ alone. Grit is the ability to withstand in pursuit of your goal, not just in overcoming momentary distractions, but in a sustained pursuit over years, if not decades. How do we cultivate grit? One critical feature of grit is key, and that is to learn how it remains supple, to learn how grit can become not dysfunctional persistence, but a supple, elastic form of pursuit. When I spoke with Angela, she didn't have an answer to the question of how grit remains supple. She pointed me back to the arts. She pointed me back to creative endeavor. There are invaluable tactics for living that the creative arts offer the world. An explorer who is extraordinarily gritty made me think of this supple form of grit as well. This man's name is Ben Saunders, and you are in fact looking at what seems to be nothing on your screen. Uh, his pursuit to become the third person in the world to reach solo and on foot the North Pole, and after this pursuit, the South Pole. The ice sheets would often move underneath him as he would attempt to walk forward. He would sleep and pitch his tent, check his GPS, wake up, and realize that he had erased his entire gain from the prior day just by sleeping, because the ice sheets had moved in the opposite direction of his goal. He described the importance in that moment when those ice sheets had moved of surrender. He said, Sarah, I can't think of another word more appropriate than surrender. It's not about giving up, but it's instead about giving over what you can no longer control so that you can focus your energy on what you can, what's right in front of you. I wrote about these traits not as characteristics in the book. I focused on individual lives and realized only in the end that these three paradoxes were critical for understanding how improbable foundations lead to the extraordinary creative works that we all know and celebrate. My hope is that in offering you several of these examples, you've been able to think through how, in your own creative pursuits, you harness the gift of not just success, but mastery, and know that it's propelled and necessarily impelled by the near win. My hope is that I've either confirmed for you the importance of private domains or inspired you to have one for yourself, the kind of what Albert Einstein would call the worldly cloister in which we hatch our best ideas. And finally, my hope is that you remain gritty in your pursuit, but also know when to pivot, as Samuel Morse did, and then maintain your goal in your mind's eye, as would a Ben Saunders. We often, outside of rooms like this, see creativity as a kind of respite from life, a kind of luxury. But the process that we undergo in any creative act entails and exemplifies the most, I would say, foundational states through which we understand the process of becoming our full selves and living our full lives anew constantly.